Welcome to the Behavioral Groups Podcast. My name is Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. We usually interview interesting people in order to unlock insights into behavioral science and how we can apply them to work and life. But this is one of our grooving sessions.
Yay!
Where Kurt and I get to explore in depth a key concept or idea that intrigues us.
This episode is brought to you by Behavior Alchemy and the Lantern Group, two companies that do great BS.
That's behavioral science, right?
Is there any other BS? Isn't that the only kind?
Okay, so today's episode is going to be fun because we're going to talk about our favorite behavioral science books and a couple of papers.
Yeah, we'll start to talk about some classics, some standards, as well as then bring in some of our own favorite newer books, as well as some that might be a little under the radar. Tim gets 5 books, I get five books, and we just might list out some more at the end. So, Tim, let's start with the classics.
Okay, Influence. I'm going to start with 1984, Influence by Robert Cialdini. Must read.
Across the board, again, impacting a number of other people around that are now doing this, has changed kind of how we think about persuasion and influence. Fantastic.
Okay.
I am going to go with Predictably Irrational.
Dan Ariely's book.
Dan Ariely. And you have a certain way of telling people how to read this. What is it?
My favorite way of reading this is start with chapter 4, The Cost of Social Norms. If you like, it's 29 pages in paperback. If you like those 29 pages, then read the rest of the book. But start with chapter 4. That's my recommendation.
29 pages in paperback? Is it? What's the hardcover count?
I don't know.
Oh my gosh, Tim, you're letting me down. All right, okay, your turn.
Okay, I'm going to go with Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman.
Danny Kahneman.
2011 Nobel Prize winner in 2002.
Big book, but oh my gosh, it is packed and just loaded with all of the behavioral economics and behavioral science wisdom that you could ever want.
If you're a nerd, you've got to read it. It's fabulous. Okay, what's your number 4?
All right, so I'm going to go with another, Nobel Prize winner here, and Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein and Nudge. Again, a classic that is just out there that really, I think, embodies a lot of, I think, what gets people excited about behavioral science and bringing in concepts that are easy to go, yeah, you know what? I see that too. And now there's some actual science behind it. So.
Yeah. Okay, so Influence, Nudge, Predictably Irrational, Thinking Fast and Slow. Those are the 4 classics that we're recommending that pretty much everybody who's interested in behavioral sciences, if you haven't read those, read them.
Right.
But Kurt, what's your number 1 recommended pick beyond the classics?
Well, I don't know if I can put these in an order, so I'm just listing these. And it was hard enough to pick 5 out of the. I mean, people should be looking at the Behavioral Grooves room here that we're doing this. So it's covered. Our table is covered with all these books, and we're going back and forth on them. However, I will say, Driven by Paul Lawrence and Neria. And actually, this started. If you can read this, there's a 2008 Harvard Business Review article by Noria Grainsberg and Lee. That was my intro into this book. But this is the book that outlines the 4-drive model, which again, in my work, in my viewpoint, has changed how I think about motivation, how I bring motivation in and talk to people about employee motivation in particular. A very holistic look across the board, brings in some evolutionary psychology in order to understand why we're doing these different things, has the holistic and actionable component that I think is just fantastic.
You've based a lot of your practice on I mean, your consulting practice is largely based on the 4-drive model, or much of your work is.
Yeah, a lot of it. And I will, at the point when I read that 2008 article, I had 2 full-time employees. I said, we are actually going to change how we do business. It was that readily apparent. I bought them the book. So we all read the book. We did a book report on it. We did weekly kind of deep dives into the different chapters. We took it apart. We structured it. We then went in and said, where are the things that are missing from it? What are the other things that we can do? Fantastic. But yeah, we've based a lot of the consulting work that we do. And I think it works. It is really, I think that's part of why I like it, because within organizations, the 4 drive model, which is what they talk about, is really helpful in defining how you can impact employee motivation. So, all right.
Yeah, it's a very powerful model.
We got a lot of books to go through. So, Tim, your choice number 1 out of multitude.
Out of the multitude. This was really hard. I'm going to start with George Lowenstein's Exotic Preferences. It's a compilation that George put together in 2007 of certainly not all of his work. George is one of the most highly published researchers in almost any field,
right?
But certainly in the behavioral science, he's way up there in terms of published pieces. But Exotic Preferences is a great. It's 700 pages, so it's not the kind of thing you just sit down and page through, because what he did though was it speaks to variety and depth of study, not just in George's interest, but in all of the behavioral sciences. So he covers a wide variety of content. It's organized really, really well. So he edited it just beautifully so that all of these papers are organized in appropriate categories that are easy to work through. And if you have a particular interest in something or you're researching something, you can go to that particular chapter and look at the papers and the articles that he's written around that. And I think that that's really terrific. And one of my favorite parts is that sort of like when we say that the questions that you ask are really revealing about who we are. Mm-hmm. Well, the way that George curated this is very revealing about the tremendous diversity of curiosities that he has. And I think that is inspiring to me, and really I think it should be inspiring to all of us when it comes to what should we study or what's of interest to us. George lays out a case basically with this book that there's a wide variety of things that we can study with behavioral sciences and apply.
Well,
things.
I am now having to put that onto my must-read list. I have not read that. I've read many of George's papers, but I have not actually read that. I do have his behavioral science and marketing or some textbook that's upstairs that I read through all the time. So I'm excited to read this.
Good. Okay, what's next on your list?
All right. So I'm gonna fall back into a brand new one. As I mentioned to people, we just had her on the podcast, but it is my favorite new book of 2018, which is Annie Duke, Thinking in Bets.
For good reason. It's a good read.
It is a really good read. The writing is really accessible. She tells some fantastic stories that bring these principles to light. But I think more importantly, and we've actually started doing this, is there are some really actionable pieces within the book in how you can improve your decision making, thinking in probabilities, right? Taking that thought of it's not black and white, not 100% or 0%, but there's some probable component that in almost all of our lives that's there. And so if you start thinking that way, it makes your decision making that much better.
Well, we're doing it like 72% of the time.
I'm doing it 83% of the time. But I mean, it just in that simple manner, it's changed how we've actually communicated. The other piece, and I've talked about this,
and to good effect, by the way.
To very good effect.
Yeah.
The other piece I think that she brings up is this concept called resulting. Right? And mm-hmm. basing the quality of your decision-making process on the results that you have instead of actually looking at the components that went into the decision-making. And there's a component of luck, again, that most of us have within our stuff. And so having that, the learning groups components, the great stories, it is a fantastic book. People go out, buy it, read it. Now. There you go. All right. Number 2 for you.
Number 2 for me is Sheena Iyengar's The Art of Choosing.
All right.
First of all, I was a big fan of the jelly jar study, the jam study. Mm. So Sheena's was the when she was at Stanford did the study on whether how attractive 6 jam jars versus 24 jam jars would be, and then more importantly, what do we do with that? Which display sells more jam, the 6 jar or the 24 jar?
Right.
And I'm just going to let that hang out there and let people go and read the book because it's so good. And she's a good writer, and she's got great research to back it up. And some of the things that I found fascinating about her decision making were the personal stories about her parents growing up in India and having the arranged marriage, and she's blind. And so when it comes to deciding what she wears, deciding what she wears is a very important decision to make. She's not able to make that decision. So
wow.
Yeah, so it's fascinating from a personal perspective. She really talks about how decisions are influenced by our environment, by framing, by priming, how much we get primed, all sorts of things that are beyond our conscious decision making. And I think that this book would be really good for people who feel like they always need to have a lot of options. It really got me thinking about how many options do I really need to make a good decision?
The art of choosing. Great. Good.
Okay, next on your list.
All right, so I had to choose because I wanted to do something on willpower. So I chose The Willpower Instinct by Kelly McGonigal. But I could have just as easily, maybe not quite as easily, picked Willpower by Roy Baumeister and John Tierney.
Hey, wait, you can't have two picks.
I didn't. I picked one. Do you see how I did that?
No.
You see, I picked The Willpower Instinct.
You are totally sneaking in.
How self-control works, why it matters, and what you can do to get more of it.
You are totally sneaking in a second pick.
I did not. Anyway, I liked this book. Again, this is one of those books that goes back into how it impacted me in my life. And so there was this period where I started reading these books about willpower and how willpower, again, is like that muscle and you can train it, or if you don't use it, it goes away, and how you can get tired and various different things. Now, again, there's some replication on some of these studies that is coming into play, but I still think that it's a really interesting way of thinking about how we change. And we can't change most of the time willpower in and of itself. And that's what they're talking about. Or at least that's the insights that I got from this book and maybe that other book that I mentioned as well. And what we can do about how do you actually tap into willpower? What are some of those things that decrease your willpower? And what are those factors from an environment or a contextual perspective that enable willpower to actually succeed? And so all of those things around it, again, great. She's a professor, I think, in LA. I can't remember which school it is, but she ran a class on this, and the stories from her class are fantastic, which again makes it a really good read. Pretty easy to get through. So I recommend The Willpower Instinct.
Okay, excellent.
Yours.
Jonah Lehrer's How We Decide.
We're going there right now.
I want to. I really want to. I really let's just set aside the plagiarism issues and the controversy. Let's just set that aside for just a second.
Okay, we're coming back to it.
I promise we'll come back to it. But the book is really well researched. Jonah Lehrer is a tremendous writer. He is a journalist first.
He is.
But he is a guy who has been very curious about brain science, neuroscience, and behavioral sciences. So he doesn't come to it lightly. And I'm looking for a copy. Okay, here.
Thank you.
So he introduced me to Antonio Damasio, which led me to Descartes' error from 1997. So which that is, if that book did that, it's a good gateway to better learning. It's a
gateway drug to behavioral science. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And, okay, so now on the controversy. So he was found out. Jonah was discovered. If you don't know this story, he was discovered to have plagiarized in one of his books. Imagine.
Well, and make up, not just plagiarize. He made up stories and examples, and the famous one is this whole reason why Bob Dylan went on and wrote or continued to write and various different things, which is really sad.
It is really sad, and it's wrong. It's not just sad. It's wrong. If you're writing, that's not just a bad thing to do. It's horrible.
You don't plagiarize. You don't make stuff up if it's not supposed to be a fiction.
That's right.
A piece of fiction.
But I will say this about how we decide is I'm familiar with many, maybe not all, I'm not going to make that claim, but with many of the research pieces that he referenced in the book. In the years following it, I spent a lot of time with that research and found his reporting on it and his narrative around those research papers to be accurate.
Yeah.
So I don't have any reason to believe that this book, How We Decide, is fallacious in any way.
Yeah.
I understand that it is, it's correct. I'm not a big fan of Jonah as a guy who made stuff up. That's just wrong. But I believe that this book is well presented and it's really a good read.
It is. He is a really good writer, which is the sad thing from my perspective, because he was able to take these behavioral science concepts from a scientific research study component and bring them into a format and a book that is easily accessible, not only
Very
to
much so.
people who like us who like it, but I think just the general lay reader, and really expand this community. All right.
He did that. Okay, next on your list, Kurt.
All right, so I'm going to go with another light read. It's called Change Anything. It's by Patterson, Grenny, Maxfield, Macmillan, and Switzer. It's the people who wrote Crucial Conversations and various different things. Again, this is one of those books that greatly influenced me in my work and thinking about how do we change as an individual. What are those components that go into making if we wanted to change something about ourselves? And again, they talk about the willpower trap, going back into willpower, and that we often think, well, if I just have enough willpower, I'm able to change. And they're looking at this and saying, no, there are some environmental components. There are some incentives that need to happen. There are things about the social arena within which you work. And it's a really powerful and it's a well-written book. And there's some really cool videos that go along with it that they show these kids, they videotape kids in a situation where they're earning money and how they then spend that money, and they set up two different experiments. It's definitely not research publishable quality, but oh my gosh, it is really fun to watch. That's
very cool.
Yeah.
You've been sitting on that one. I don't think we've ever talked about that.
There you go.
Yeah, I totally dig that.
All right.
That's good.
All right, you.
The Invisible Gorilla by Chris Chabris and Dan Simons.
Another great video.
If you haven't seen the video, you gotta check out the video. But that book came out in 2010, long after Chris and Dan started their work on inattentive blindness and perceptual blindness, which is fascinating for me because it tracks both the neuroscience and the psychological aspects of how things that flow into our eyes are not necessarily things that our brains process. And I find that sort of selective vision or possibly motivated vision to be particularly interesting because it impacts our decision making. One of their great studies was that of the bicyclists that got hit by cars, and so they interviewed both the bicyclist and the driver of the car. And in 47% of these accidents, the driver said, "Oh my gosh, I didn't see them until they were right on the hood. They just appeared out of nowhere." And yet, almost all of those situations, the bicycle rider said, "I made eye contact with the driver. Like we were in tune. Like I got the okay that I'm okay crossing because we actually locked eyes." And so there's things that we don't see and we don't acknowledge that I find just fascinating. And Dan Simon especially, but of course Chris as well. But their work is just tremendous. So
yeah.
I strongly recommend if you're interested in decision making from the perspective of things that we're aware of and things that we're not aware of.
I think it's a great book. Wonderful video that kind of highlights this in a really aha way for many people, and so various different things.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So my last of my 5 books is more of a I don't know, academic book. It is Work Motivation, History, Theory, Research, and Practice by Gary Latham.
He's a tremendous researcher.
Tremendous researcher. And again, looking at the work that we do, which is around work motivation, really gets into some of the clinical and theoretical background. And again, Latham did a lot of work on goal setting.
With Ed Locke.
Locke. And
goal setting theory came about because
goal setting theory was his work. And so he goes back from, going back to 1975 through 2000, outlining all this different work, various different things, talking about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, bringing those out and really looking at the research well before I think, behavioral economics or behavioral science was around in the manner that it is today, but is that ground, kind of the foundation for really a lot of the work that we do, and a lot of the interest that I think is really fascinating to me about why we do the things that we do.
Well, and so much of Gary Latham's work has been replicated. So it's good science and really good research. And so when it comes to especially goal setting and motivation, his work is just tremendous. Yeah, I highly recommend it.
All right. Going to yours.
My last book, my number 5 is Francesca Gino's Sidetracked.
Okay.
It was her first kind of big book, 2013, where she focused on preference reversal, which is how our preferences really aren't as universal as we think we are. Like they're labile, right? They change from environment to environment. And this book does Francesca did a great job of explaining how this preference reversal plays out in our lives. And she goes so far, of course, because she's now a Harvard professor. I think we first met when she was at Chapel Hill, but she speaks to how we can correct for the decisions that aren't necessarily in our best self-interest. And I think that that's an important part of it, is that she's very practical about how to actually do something with this stuff.
So Sidetracked
by Francesca Gino.
All right. So those are the 5 that we had to curate out of this plethora of different books that we have. But I think we should have honorable mentions.
Oh, gosh, we've got so many, man. We've got so many.
Well, and we talked about this. So, any of the books by Gladwell, Malcolm Gladwell, or Daniel Pink. And again, we have our issues. I have some issues, particularly with some of Daniel Pink in Drive, and some of the way that he took it. And again, these are writers, right?
They're journalists.
Who are taking. Pink was the speechwriter for Clinton. Malcolm Gladwell, New York Times, journalist. But they're really good writers.
They're very bright men too.
And they're very bright, and they take this scientific information and translate it and tell stories about it that get it out into the general public. And I think there's value in that. The value for people who are interested in behavioral science beyond that cursory component, though, or the caution, is looking beyond their findings and the way that they're take the research that they have. That's really important. And they'll go in and look into that,
Yeah, my concern, and I agree. First of all, let me start with the agreement, because Gladwell and Pink are excellent writers, and they've done really good work in compiling the information that they've written about in Blink, Tipping Point, Outliers, Drive, Dan Pink's work. These are well-written books. My concern is that they parse this content together as if it's a be-all, end-all. And I think as researchers, as people concerned about behavioral sciences, they're picking off very, very slim parts. This is the Occam's razor, that they're kind of making a very thin pass in order to prove a big point. And it's not that point isn't valid. The things that they say are well researched and correct. However, there are large bodies of evidence that are, in some cases, are contrary.
Right, and they don't go into that. And it is almost a motivated reasoning of the research that they select to support this concept that they have. And I think
it's
granted,
because they're journalists.
They're journalists, and I don't think they necessarily go into it thinking that way.
No.
I think they go in, they're looking at a body of research, they have a question in their head, and they're finding things, and then they just focus in on it. And again, they're not researchers. So that's it, all and well, but I think they're really good.
Yeah.
Other honorable mentions.
The Righteous Mind.
No, we've talked about that in many of our recent podcasts. It comes up over and over.
It does. Jonathan Haidt's work from 2012 is just excellent, and read it. That's all I can say. What else comes on the list?
I The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. Again, he's a journalist, and he takes this information on habits and research. But again, well written, very actionable.
Yeah,
just a good book in getting to understand how habits actually take a big portion of our life that we don't really even think about.
How about a great read that is not written by a journalist, but written by a Harvard professor, and that is Dan Gilbert's Stumbling on Happiness.
Very happy book. No.
I loved it.
I love it. No, it's a great book. And another watch his TED Talk, because he is a number of TED Talks. They're really good. Short kind of synopsis of the book. I also would recommend The Happiness Advantage by Sean Aker.
Yeah.
Another Harvard alum. I don't know if he's teaching there now or not.
I'm not sure if he is either.
But again, bringing that concept of, we always strive to achieve happiness, and we think success or getting that new car or whatever it will lead us to happiness. And his concept, and I think kind of proving it to a certain degree, or at least as much as you can prove with scientific research, is saying happiness actually precedes success. And so, which is a really interesting concept.
It really is. There's a not so well-known book, at least in the circles that I've talked about this with, by a Swiss researcher and journalist named Rolf Dobelli. Dobelli, yeah, Rolf Dobelli. And the book is called The Art of Thinking Clearly. And it is 99 anecdotes and research points around behavioral science that are just brilliant. It's so beautifully packaged and research-wise, scientifically accurate. Strong recommendation.
Fantastic. I would bring in Sway by Ori and Ram Brofman.
Yeah, the Brofman brothers. Yeah, that's good stuff.
It's really interesting. It came out almost the same time as Nudge did. Has similar kind of insights, but didn't get kind of, I think, the popular press that Nudge did.
No.
But again, easy read, good qualitative or good quantitative research in it, all of that kind of stuff.
Definitely. Priceless by William Poundstone, especially if you work in a retail world. Highly recommended for understanding the framing and anchoring that the prices have on us. It's mostly intuitive, but it's really good research, and it's really well written. And then I know one of our favorites, Brain Rules by John Medina.
That's a great one. Good one. I think there's a couple others, go really quick. Freakonomics, Levitt and Dubnar. Again, sometimes question some of their findings and different things of that. But again, really good just to say, hey, things aren't always as they seem. Descartes' Error, Antonio Damasio that you talked about, bringing in the brain science and some of those studies with some of his patients about memory and motivation are just fantastic. And again, highlight, for those people, he's talking with people who are sick or have some brain damage, but the insights that has on us is really impactful, and it brings it around really, really neat. Cialdini's new book,
Persuasion.
Yep.
That's
Priming,
a good one.
all of those factors, really good.
And we were going to mention paper. I want to mention one paper here that was influential, deeply influential in my own work, and it was called The Labor Supply of New York City Cab Drivers, One Day at a Time. And that was a compilation of George Lowenstein, Richard Thaler, Colin Kammer, and Linda Babcock. It's a great study. It's a great study that combines labor economics with motivation. It's a beautifully written paper, but it's a big surprise on motivation and money.
Yeah.
So highly recommended.
Very cool. Just going to list out a couple more because I know we're running late here. So Play to Win, Larry Wilson and Hirsch Wilson of
Definitely.
Wilson Learning and Pecos River. Again, I would classify these guys as accidental behavioral scientists. They don't bring science and research in, but the insights that they have and the way they talk about it, really actionable, great information, just because I think
Solid
they're really
stuff.
good observers of human behavior.
These guys are very smart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Change or Die by Alan Deutschman, again, started off with an article in Fast Company about, why people who've had major heart component don't, after 2 years, basically 11% of them are following their doctor's orders. And it's not a matter of if you're going to die, it's just a matter of when you're going to die if you don't change. So again, can't be more motivated than that for most people, but Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. I can never pronounce his last name. Great book. And Appreciative Inquiry. Any of the work by David Cooper Ryder on that. Again, early work from the 80s and 90s that talks about how we frame things and how we frame things from an organizational perspective, but also how we frame things in our mind and how that influences the results that we get from it.
And we didn't even get to Carol Dweck's mindset or Angela Duckworth's grit. Yeah,
or Self-Efficacy by Bandura, or
there's a lot more. But this is going to end our grooving session on books for the time being, and we just want to say, go out and give us a good review.
Please.
If you have a chance to give us a good review, we would certainly appreciate that. And in the meantime, keep on grooving.
Keep on grooving.